The village of Ashenmore had always whispered warnings about the hollow peaks, those jagged mountains that clawed at the horizon like broken teeth against a bruised sky. Cale Thorne had heard every legend, every cautionary tale spun by firelight in the village square, yet none of those stories had prepared him for the peculiar desperation that now drove him deeper into the forbidden caves than any living soul had ventured in 3 centuries. He was not a hero. He wanted to make that abundantly clear to himself as his boots scraped against the damp stone, his torch casting wild shadows that danced like phantoms along the walls. Heroes were the men in songs, the ones who slayed dragons for glory and rescued princesses for honor. Cale was a cartographer, a maker of maps, a documenter of forgotten places. His motivation was far more mundane than heroism, it was survival. The Merchant Guild had promised him enough gold to escape his debts if he could chart the lost passages of the Hollow Peaks, passages rumored to connect to ancient trade routes that might bypass the war-torn territories to the south. The air grew colder as he descended, each breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the pressing darkness. The cave system was a labyrinth of natural architecture. Stalactites hung like frozen daggers, stalagmites rose like the teeth of some slumbering titan, and everywhere the sound of dripping water echoed with an almost musical quality. Cale had been mapping for 3 days, sleeping in shallow alcoves, rationing his supplies, and trying not to think about how many wrong turns might leave him lost forever in this subterranean world. It was on the 4th day, when his torch was burning low and his water was nearly gone, that he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the natural symphony of the cave. It was a voice, or perhaps 2 voices, harmonizing in a language he couldn't understand. The melody was haunting, beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten and his pulse quicken. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Cale followed the sound. The passage narrowed, forcing him to turn sideways, his pack scraping against the rough stone. Then suddenly, it opened into a chamber so vast that his torchlight couldn't reach its ceiling. And there, in the center of that cathedral-like space, illuminated by a shaft of impossible crimson moonlight that seemed to pierce through solid rock, he saw them. The cage was ancient, wrought from some dark metal that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Its bars were inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than Cale's eyes could properly process. But it wasn't the cage that stole his breath and rooted his feet to the stone floor. It was the 2 women trapped within it. The first thing Cale noticed was their wings, magnificent structures of membrane and bone that stretched from their backs, too large for the confines of the cage, folded and compressed in ways that must have been agonizing. The wings were both similar and distinct. One pair bore the deep crimson of arterial blood, the other the silver white of starlight on snow. These were not decorative appendages or artistic flourishes. These were real, functional wings, and they marked their bearers as something decidedly inhuman. The sister on the left seemed carved from winter itself. Her hair fell in long silver cascades that pooled on the cage floor like liquid moonlight, and her skin held the luminous pallor of marble or fresh snow. She wore what might have once been armor, Gothic plates of black metal adorned with Baroque designs, but time and captivity had left it dented and tarnished. Her face was a study in contradictions, aristocratic cheekbones and a full mouth that suggested sensuality, but eyes that glowed with an inner fire the color of fresh blood, cold and calculating and utterly ancient. When those eyes fixed on Cale, he felt the gaze like a physical touch, assessing him with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Her sister was darkness to her light, shadow to her ice. Raven-black hair tumbled in wild waves around a face that was no less beautiful but infinitely more dangerous in its softness. Where the silver-haired woman projected cold dominance, this one radiated a different kind of threat, the dangerous allure of the deep ocean, the sweet poison of oleander flowers. Her dress had once been elegant, layers of dark fabric now torn and stained, revealing the curves of a body that seemed designed to provoke desire and destruction in equal measure. Her eyes burned with the same crimson fire as her sister's, but in them Cale saw not calculation but hunger, raw, desperate, and all-consuming. They moved in unison, both rising from their positions on the cage floor with a fluid grace that defied the cramped space. Their wings stirred, creating currents of air that made Kale's torch gutter. And then they spoke, their voices overlapping, one cool and commanding, the other warm and pleading, but both saying the same thing in the common tongue. Free us. Kale's hand instinctively went to the iron knife at his belt. Not that such a weapon would do anything against creatures like these. His mind raced through the legends. Vampires. Blood drinkers. Immortal predators who had terrorized humanity in the age before the Sundering, when magic flowed freely through the world. They had been hunted, sealed away, destroyed by the thousands. But some, the story said, had been too powerful to kill, and so they had been imprisoned in places where no mortal would ever find them. Until now. Kale's voice came out as a croak. He swallowed and tried again. I'm just a mapmaker. I didn't come here looking for you. I didn't even know you existed. The silver-haired vampire tilted her head, the gesture somehow both curious and predatory. When she spoke, her voice had the clarity of a crystal bell, each word precisely articulated. Yet here you stand, Kale Thorne of Ashenmoor, son of Marcus the blacksmith and Elena the seamstress, 26 years old, unmarried, burdened with debts you did not earn and seeking a way out of a life that has given you nothing but disappointment. Kale's blood turned to ice in his veins. How do you? Your blood speaks to us, the dark-haired sister interrupted, her voice a sultry whisper that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate in his chest. It sings your story in every heartbeat. We have been trapped here for 300 years, mortal, alone in the dark with nothing but the taste of each other's essence to sustain us. We know hunger. We know desperation. And we know opportunity when it presents itself. 300 years, Kale repeated, trying to process the implications. You've been trapped here for 3 centuries? 327 years, 4 months and 18 days, the silver-haired one said, her crimson eyes never leaving his face. Since the sorcerer King Aldrich Ravenska betrayed us, since the covenant we made in good faith was turned into chains, since we were sealed away and left to slowly starve in this lightless hell. I am Seraphine Nightblood, daughter of the Eclipse Throne, first of her name. And this is my sister Lilith. Lilith moved closer to the bars, her movements achingly sensual despite the obvious pain of her folded wings. Her hands gripped the metal, and Kale saw that her fingers ended in delicate claws, each one perfectly manicured despite the centuries of imprisonment. We're dying, she said simply, and in that moment, all the seduction fell away, leaving only raw honesty. Slowly, agonizingly, we're fading. Vampires can survive a long time without blood, but not forever. Not like this. Another decade, perhaps 2, and we'll fall into the final sleep. We'll become nothing more than beautiful corpses in a forgotten cage. Then give me one good reason why I should release you, Kale said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Every story I've ever heard says that vampires are monsters. That you slaughter indiscriminately, that you see humans as nothing more than food or playthings. Why shouldn't I just walk away and let you rot? Seraphine's laugh was like breaking glass, sharp and beautiful and dangerous. Because you won't, she said with absolute certainty. I can taste your curiosity, your loneliness, your desperate need to matter in a world that has dismissed you as insignificant. You won't walk away because this is the first time in your miserable little life that you've encountered something truly extraordinary, and you're too intelligent to waste that opportunity. My sister has always lacked subtlety, Lilith interjected with a gentle smile that didn't reach her burning eyes. What she means is that we can offer you something, Kale. Something more valuable than all the gold in the Merchant Guild's coffers. We can offer you purpose. Power. A life beyond the mundane existence of debt and disappointment. In exchange for what? Kale asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Your blood, Seraphine said bluntly. But not your life. We don't need to drain you dry. A vampire of our age and power can sustain themselves on surprisingly little, especially if the source is willing. Feed us and we'll be strong enough to reclaim our place in this world. We'll make you wealthy beyond imagining. We'll protect you from any who might wish you harm. We'll give you knowledge that died with the old world. All we ask is that you be our anchor to life, our vessel of renewal. Our husband, Lilith added softly, and the word hung in the air like a physical thing. Kale blinked. Your what? Husband, Seraphine repeated, her cold expression softening slightly. In vampire culture, the bond between a vampire and their willing donor is sacred. It's not merely a transaction of blood for services, it's a covenant, a marriage of essences. You would be bound to us and we to you, in ways that transcend your mortal understanding of relationships. We would be yours and you would be ours until death finally claims you in old age. Or until we choose to turn you, Lilith purred, and make that death nothing more than a transition to eternal life at our sides. Cale's mind was spinning. This was insane. This was beyond insane. He should be running, should be sealing this chamber behind him and warning every village from here to the coast about what lay sleeping in the hollow peaks. But Seraphine had been right, he was curious. More than curious. He was entranced. Why both of you? He asked. Why would two vampire princesses, if that's what you are, want to share a single mortal? The sisters exchanged a glance, and for the first time, Cale saw something other than cold calculation or desperate hunger in their expressions. He saw affection, deep and genuine and utterly unconditional. Because we are not just sisters, Seraphine said quietly. We are twins, born in the same moment, turned in the same ceremony, bound together by blood and magic and 3,000 years of shared existence. In all that time we have never been parted, never taken separate paths. We are two halves of a single soul and what we share completely. Including this. Including you if you accept. Cale sat down heavily on the cold stone floor, his torch planted beside him, trying to think through the impossible choice before him. The logical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 26 years of disappointments and setbacks, screamed at him to leave, to run, to put as much distance between himself and these creatures as humanly possible. But the rest of him, the parts he usually kept locked away beneath layers of pragmatism and resignation, were singing a very different song. How long had he felt like a ghost in his own life? How many years had he spent making maps of places he'd never truly explore, drawing borders around regions he'd never visit, documenting a world he was never meant to be more than a footnote in? His father had died from a bad batch of steel that wasn't his fault, and Cale had inherited debts from a supplier who defrauded them both. His mother had followed within a year, her heart broken. He'd been 23 then, and he'd spent the last 3 years working himself to exhaustion, taking jobs that paid poorly and risked much, trying to dig himself out of a hole that only grew deeper. What did he really have to lose? Tell me about the covenant, he said finally. What would it actually mean? What would you expect from me? Lilith moved closer to the bars, sinking into a graceful crouch that put her eyes level with his. This close, he could see the delicate tracery of veins beneath her pale skin, could smell something sweet and faintly spiced, like cinnamon and honey in old wine. The blood bond is both simple and profound, she explained, her voice taking on a lecturing quality that suggested she was drawing on ancient knowledge. 3 times you would offer us your blood willingly, with full knowledge and acceptance of what we are. After the 3rd feeding, the bond would be complete and unbreakable. You would become our day walker, our eyes and hands in the sunlit world we can no longer enter. We would become your guardians, your protectors, your lovers if you desired, bound to your service as completely as you would be bound to our nourishment. We would feel your emotions as if they were our own, Seraphine continued, her tone more clinical but no less intense. Your pain would be our pain. Your joy would be our joy. If you were threatened, we would know instantly, no matter the distance between us. The bond would extend your life significantly, not to immortality, but you could live to see 2 or 3 centuries pass if you chose. And in that time, you would possess strength greater than any mortal, healing that would make you nearly impossible to kill, and access to the accumulated knowledge of 2 of the oldest vampires ever to walk this world. And the cost? Cale pressed. There's always a cost. Your freedom, Seraphine said bluntly. Not in the sense that you would be our slave, far from it. But you would never be entirely your own person again. Our needs would become your needs. Our enemies would become your enemies. And when the bond is consummated through blood, there is no severing it. Only death can end a vampire's covenant. Also, Lilith added with a mischievous smile, you'd have to deal with both of us. Our personalities. Our quirks. Our occasional disagreements. Seraphine can be cold and imperious. I can be impulsive and emotional. We've had 300 years to get on each other's nerves in this cage, and I won't pretend we're always the picture of sisterly harmony. Despite everything, Cale found himself laughing. It was a short, slightly hysterical sound, but it was genuine. "You're actually trying to sell me on this?" he said wonderingly. "You're imprisoned, starving, desperate, and you're giving me reasons why this might be difficult for me." "Because we want your choice to be real," Seraphine said, and for the first time her cold mask cracked completely, revealing something vulnerable beneath. "We have been betrayed before, Cale Thorne. We know what it means to enter a covenant with someone who sees us only as tools, as means to an end. King Aldrich promised us sanctuary in exchange for our service in his wars. He promised us respect and recognition. Instead, he used us until we were no longer convenient, then had his sorcerers seal us away like monsters. We will not make that mistake again. If you free us, if you bond with us, we want it to be because you choose it, freely, fully, with your eyes open to both the benefits and the burdens." Cale looked between the two sisters, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. They were terrifying, yes. They were dangerous, absolutely. But they were also profoundly, achingly lonely. 3 centuries of imprisonment, with nothing but each other and the slow fade toward oblivion. They could have lied to him, could have promised him anything to secure their freedom. Instead, they were being honest, brutally, almost painfully honest. "How do I free you?" he asked quietly. The relief that flooded through both sisters was palpable, transforming their expressions from desperate hope to something approaching wonder. Seraphine straightened, her regal bearing reasserting itself, while Lilith's eyes filled with tears of blood that tracked down her pale cheeks like rubies. "The cage is bound by sorcery," Seraphine explained, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "But the lock is purely physical, Aldrich's arrogance. He wanted to be able to boast that his prisoners were held not just by magic but by his personal key. When he died in the war 60 years after our imprisonment, the key was lost, but the lock remains. It's old iron, strong but not unbreakable. If you can shatter it, the magical bindings will collapse." Cale examined the lock. It was massive, crude by modern standards but solid. He had his iron knife, but that wouldn't make a dent. He had his climbing hammer, meant for driving pitons into rock. That might work, but it would take time and strength. "There's another way," Lilith said, reading his hesitation. "The symbols on the bars, they draw power from the earth itself, a constant flow of energy that maintains the binding. But they were carved 3 centuries ago when the magic was stronger. The world has changed. Magic has faded. The symbols are weaker than they were. If you can disrupt just one of them, create a break in the circuit, the entire structure will destabilize long enough for us to break free from within." Cale studied the nearest symbol, one of the twisted runes that hurt to look at directly. "How do I disrupt it without triggering something worse?" "Blood," Seraphine said simply. "Your blood, specifically. The wards were keyed to prevent vampire blood from touching them. Any contact from us would strengthen the bindings. But mortal blood freely given? That was never anticipated. A single drop on the central rune right there." She pointed to a symbol that seemed to pulse with a sickly green light. "It will create a dissonance, a rejection. The magic will recoil, and in that moment of chaos, we can exert our full strength against the physical restraints." Cale didn't hesitate. He drew his knife, pressed the tip to his thumb, and squeezed until a fat drop of blood welled up. Moving carefully, he reached through the bars, his arm could just barely fit between them, and let the drop fall onto the designated rune. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The rune flared white-hot, then began to crack, spiderweb fissures racing across its surface. The entire cage began to shake, a deep thrumming sound that Cale felt in his bones. The crimson moonlight intensified, became almost blinding, and in its radiance, the sisters transformed. Their wings unfurled to their full majestic span, Seraphine's silver membranes shot through with veins of black, Lilith's crimson expanses edged with shadow. Their eyes blazed like furnace fires. And when they moved against the bars of their prison, they moved with strength that was barely comprehensible. Metal shrieked. Stone cracked. The ancient cage, which had held them for over 3 centuries, simply exploded outward in a shower of twisted metal and failing magic. Cale was thrown backward by the force of it, landing hard on the stone floor. His vision swam, his ears rang, and for a moment he wondered if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then hands, cold but gentle, were helping him up, and he found himself standing between the two sisters, their wings creating a canopy above him, their presence overwhelming. "Thank you," Lilith whispered, and she leaned in to press her forehead against his, a gesture of profound intimacy and gratitude. Her closeness was intoxicating, her scent filling his senses, making his pulse race. "The debt is acknowledged," Seraphine said formally, though her hand on his shoulder was warm, or at least, less cold than he'd expected. "Now comes the question, do you wish to complete the covenant or was this freedom enough? We will honor your choice either way. If you wish to walk away, we will grant you safe passage from these caves and never trouble you again." Cale looked at Lilith's face inches from his own, her crimson eyes full of hope and hunger. He looked at Seraphine, standing with regal pride but with a vulnerability in her expression that she couldn't quite hide. He thought about his life in Ashenmoor, the grinding poverty, the loneliness, the sense that he was destined for nothing more than a footnote in history. Then he thought about what they were offering: purpose, power, belonging. A life that mattered. A bond with beings who were ancient and terrible and utterly, devastatingly real. "I accept the covenant," he said clearly. "All of it. The bond, the responsibilities, the connection. I choose this freely." The sisters exchanged a look of pure, undisguised relief and joy. Then Seraphine stepped back, gesturing to Lilith. "She should be first," the silver-haired vampire said quietly. "She's always been the one with the softer touch, the one who understands gentleness. I would make this hurt, not from cruelty but from desperation. Let her show you that feeding can be more than pain." Lilith cupped Cale's face with both hands, her touch feather-light. "It will hurt at first," she admitted. "Our fangs carry venom that prevents clotting, that makes the blood flow freely. But after the initial bite, the venom also carries a euphoric agent. It's our gift to those who feed us willingly, a sharing of pleasure, not just a taking of life. Trust me?" Cale nodded, his throat too tight for words. Lilith smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed her dangerous beauty into something almost human. Then she leaned in, her lips brushing against his neck just over his pulse point, and he felt the sharp pressure of her fangs. The pain was bright and immediate, like two hot needles piercing his skin. He gasped, his hands instinctively coming up to grip her shoulders. But then, just as she'd promised, something else flooded through him. A warmth that started at the bite and spread through his entire body like liquid gold. It was pleasure, pure and overwhelming, mixed with a sense of connection that went beyond the physical. He could feel Lilith, feel her gratitude and relief and something deeper, something that might have been affection or even the beginnings of love. She drank for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. When she pulled away, her lips stained crimson, she looked years younger, her skin taking on a flush of life, her eyes burning brighter. "Oh," she breathed, "oh, Cale, you taste like sunlight and possibility. I had forgotten that blood could taste like hope." Then it was Seraphine's turn. She approached with less gentleness but no less care, her movements precise and controlled. "I'll take from your wrist," she said, lifting his hand. "A warrior's feeding. Look at me while I do this." He met her crimson gaze as she bit into the delicate skin of his inner wrist. The pain was sharper this time, more focused, but the euphoria that followed was equally intense. And in Seraphine's eyes, he saw the ice beginning to crack, saw warmth bleeding through her carefully maintained walls. When she finished, she pressed her lips to the wound in a gesture that was almost reverent. "The first feeding is complete," she announced, her voice steadier than her expression suggested. "2 more and the bond will be permanent. Are you still willing?" Cale felt lightheaded, both from blood loss and from the aftereffects of the venom, but his mind was clear. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "When?" "Not today," Lilith said gently, supporting him as his knees threatened to buckle. "You need to recover, to regain your strength. The second feeding should happen after you've rested, after your blood has replenished itself." Otherwise we risk taking too much, and that would violate the covenant before it's even complete. They made camp in that ancient chamber, using Kale's supplies and creating a space that felt almost domestic in the midst of the ruins. The sisters moved around the cave with increasing vitality, their wings folding and unfolding, their movements becoming more fluid as the blood they'd consumed spread through their systems and began the process of genuine restoration. Seraphine used some of Kale's climbing rope to secure the broken cage, creating a makeshift barrier. "Old habits," she explained when she caught him watching. "We were hunted for centuries before our imprisonment. Even free, I won't sleep without some kind of perimeter defense." Lilith, meanwhile, was going through Kale's pack with the unabashed curiosity of someone seeing common items for the first time in 300 years. She held up his compass with wonder, watched the needle swing and settle with the fascination of a child discovering magic. "The world has changed so much," she murmured. "I can smell it in your clothes, taste it in your blood. Iron and coal smoke and something electric. What has humanity built while we slept?" As Kale recovered, sipping from his water skin and eating dried meat from his supplies, he found himself telling them about the world above. About the wars that had redrawn borders, about the decline of magic and the rise of early mechanization, about the social changes and technological advances that had transformed human civilization. They listened with rapt attention, asking questions that revealed just how alien the modern world had become during their imprisonment. "No more mage kingdoms?" Seraphine asked, clearly troubled. "No more great houses of sorcery?" "Magic faded," Kale explained. "After the Sundering, the event that happened about 200 years ago, magic became weaker, less reliable. The great mages died out or lost their powers. Now, we have scholars and scientists instead, people who study the natural laws rather than trying to bend reality to their will." "A world without magic," Lilith said softly. "That's both sad and strangely hopeful. Perhaps it means a world with less cruelty, less exploitation of power." "Humanity found other things to be cruel about," Kale said dryly. "We're quite creative that way." They rested for 6 hours, taking turns keeping watch, though Kale suspected the sisters didn't actually need sleep in the conventional sense. When they finally prepared to leave the chamber, Kale realized he had no idea how they would navigate the cave system. He'd been traveling for days to reach this depth, following a complex route he'd carefully mapped. "We know these caves," Seraphine said when he voiced his concern. "We were conscious for the first century of our imprisonment, aware of every sound, every tremor, every shift in airflow. I could navigate this system blind." She wasn't exaggerating. The sisters led him through passages he hadn't discovered, shortcuts that bypassed the most treacherous sections, always moving steadily upward. Their night vision was apparently perfect, allowing them to move confidently even in absolute darkness, while Kale relied on his torch and their guidance. As they climbed, the sisters told him fragments of their story. They spoke of the old world, when vampires had been one of several apex predator species competing with humanity for dominance. They described the vampire courts, elaborate social structures built on bloodlines and power, territories and ancient feuds. They explained how they had been born human, daughters of a minor noble, before being turned in their 17th year by a vampire lord who had seen potential in them. "We were his favorites," Lilith said, her voice distant with memory. "He taught us everything, how to hunt, how to seduce, how to kill without remorse. But he also taught us honor, the old codes that governed our kind. When the human kingdoms began their great purges, when they hunted us toward extinction, he sent us away to seek sanctuary. That's how we ended up in Aldrich's court." "We thought we were so clever," Seraphine added with bitter amusement, "offering our services in exchange for protection. We won battles for him, eliminated his enemies, served him faithfully for 30 years. And he repaid us by having his court wizard design a prison specifically for our powers and sealing us away the moment we were no longer useful." "What happened to him?" Kale asked. "To King Aldrich?" "He died in a war with the Eastern Principalities," Seraphine said with satisfaction. "We felt it through the cage's magic, a sudden shift that told us our jailer was gone. We hoped someone would find us then, but the kingdom fell apart without him and these caves were forgotten. Until you." They emerged from the caves just before dawn, the sky above turning from black to deep indigo. The sisters immediately sought shadow, their bodies already reacting to the coming light. "We'll need to find shelter," Lilith said urgently. "We're stronger than we were, but we're not yet recovered enough to endure sunlight. It would burn us, possibly even destroy us if the exposure was prolonged." Kale led them to a hunting cabin he'd passed on his way to the caves, a small structure used by trappers during the winter season. It was summer now and the cabin was empty. The sisters barricaded themselves in the windowless root cellar, while Kale collapsed on the cabin's single bed, exhausted beyond measure. He slept for 12 hours straight, dreamless and deep. When he woke, it was evening again and the sisters were in the main room of the cabin, examining everything with intense curiosity. They'd found the cabin's small stock of supplies, dried goods, a jar of honey, a bottle of wine, and had arranged them on the table like artifacts in a museum. "We can't eat any of this," Seraphine said almost sadly. "Our bodies can only process blood now. Everything else is ashes in our mouths. But I remember the taste of honey, of bread and wine. 3,000 years and I still remember." Over the next 3 days they remained in the cabin, hiding from both the sun and potential discovery. Kale's strength returned steadily, helped by good food from the cabin's stores and plenty of rest. The sisters, too, continued to recover, their skin taking on more color, their movements gaining strength and certainty. It was on the third evening as they sat around the cabin's small fireplace. The sisters didn't need the warmth, but they seemed to appreciate the light and the ritual of it, that Seraphine declared Kale was ready for the second feeding. "This one will be different," she explained. "The first feeding was emergency sustenance, enough to keep us from fading. The second feeding is where the true bonding begins. When we drink from you this time, you'll drink from us in return. Not our blood, we're not turning you yet if ever, but our essence. You'll take in a small measure of our power, our vitality. It will mark you as ours and us as yours." Lilith moved to sit beside Kale on the cabin's worn couch, her body pressed against his side. "It will feel different," she said softly. "More intimate. The connection you felt during the first feeding will intensify. You'll see fragments of our memories, feel echoes of our emotions. And we'll feel yours. There will be nowhere to hide, no secrets between us." "I'm ready," Kale said and was surprised to find he meant it. This time Lilith bit into his shoulder, her fangs piercing through his shirt. The pain was familiar now, expected, and the euphoria that followed was welcome. But then something else happened. She pulled back slightly, bit into her own lip until her blood welled up, and kissed him, deep and hungry, sharing that blood between them. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Power flooded into Kale, raw and ancient, making his nerves sing and his muscles surge with impossible strength. But more than that, he felt Lilith's presence in his mind, felt her affection for him blooming like a dark flower, felt the scars of her past and the desperate hope of her present. He saw flashes of memory, a village burning, a woman screaming, a choice made in desperation that changed everything. When they broke apart, both gasping, Lilith's eyes were wide with wonder. "You're so strong," she whispered. "Your will, your core self. I expected a mortal, but you're more than that. You're resilient, adaptable. You'll be able to carry this bond without breaking." Then Seraphine took her place and the process repeated. Her bite was on his neck this time, directly over his pulse, and when she shared her blood with him through a kiss that was fierce and claiming, he felt the full force of her personality crash into him. She was ice and iron, control and calculation, but beneath that was a deep well of loyalty and protective fury. She would destroy worlds for those she claimed as hers, and now he was among that number. The second feeding left him trembling, his body processing changes he didn't fully understand. He could feel them now, both sisters, as distinct presences in the back of his mind. Not voices exactly, but impressions, emotions, a constant low-level awareness of where they were and how they felt. "The bond is 2/3 complete," Seraphine said, her voice rough with emotion she didn't bother to hide. "One more feeding and it will be permanent. But we should wait, give you time to adjust to the changes. The full bond is intense. We want you prepared for it." Entering Ashenmoor after everything that had happened felt surreal. The village was exactly as he'd left it. Small, provincial, concerned with its petty dramas and daily struggles. Cale went first to the Merchant Guild's office, where he turned in his partial maps and accepted partial payment. The guild master tried to negotiate him down, claiming the incomplete work wasn't worth the agreed-upon price, but Cale didn't argue. He simply took what was offered and left. The money would help, but it no longer mattered the way it once had. Next, he visited the creditor who held his father's debts. The man was a weasel, small and sharp-faced, who'd made a career of buying up debts at discount and then squeezing the debtors for every copper. Cale paid him half of what was owed and told him flatly that he'd get the rest when Cale returned from his next commission, if he returned at all. "You're contracted to pay monthly," the creditor sputtered. "You can't just disappear." "I'll have the magistrate." "Do whatever you need to do," Cale said calmly. "I've given you more than you deserve. If you can extract the rest from a man who's not here, more power to you." He visited his parents' graves, standing in the village cemetery as the sun climbed toward noon. He didn't pray, he'd never been particularly religious, but he spoke to them quietly, telling them about what had happened, about the choice he'd made, about the life that was opening before him. "I hope you'd understand," he said finally. "I hope you'd forgive me for choosing this instead of honoring your memory by suffering in poverty. I think you'd want me to be happy, even if happiness comes in a strange form." There was no answer, of course, but he felt something settle in his chest, a sense of closure or acceptance. He'd been carrying his parents' ghosts for 3 years, trying to live up to what he imagined they'd want. Now he was letting them go, choosing his own path. He stopped by his small rented room only long enough to gather the few possessions that mattered. His better tools, a few books, a locket that had belonged to his mother. Everything else he left for the landlord to dispose of. Then, as the sun began its descent toward evening, he walked back to the mill. The sisters were awake and waiting, their presence in the bond bright with anticipation. "It's done," he said simply. "I'm free of Ashenmore. Ready for the third feeding whenever you are." "Tonight," Seraphine decided. "Under the open sky as tradition demands. The final binding should be witnessed by the stars, the old witnesses to covenant making." They climbed to the top of a nearby hill, a place where Cale had often come as a child to look out at the world beyond his village. The sun had set, and the stars were emerging in their thousands, a glittering tapestry overhead. A moon was rising, not crimson like the impossible light in the cave, but silver and clean and bright. The sisters stood on either side of him, their wings unfurled, framing the three of them in a canopy of silver and crimson. They looked unearthly beautiful in the moonlight, like creatures from myth made flesh. "This is the final feeding," Seraphine intoned, her voice taking on a ritual cadence. "With this, the covenant becomes eternal, unbreakable save by death. Cale Thorne, do you accept us as your bound wives, your companions in blood, your partners in fate? Do you swear to sustain us with your blood, to protect our secrets, to stand with us against all threats?" "I do," Cale said clearly. "Do you accept the responsibilities and the gifts of the bond? The strength and the burden, the power and the price?" "I do." "Then we claim you," Lilith said, her voice soft but intense, "as ours now and forever. And we give ourselves to you, bound by the oldest laws, the deepest magic. Your blood is our life. Your fate is our fate." They bid him simultaneously, Seraphine at his neck, Lilith at his wrist, and the sensation was beyond anything the previous feedings had produced. Power flooded into him, so much that his body couldn't contain it, couldn't process it. He felt his bones strengthening, his muscles reshaping, his senses exploding outward. He could hear the heartbeat of a rabbit half a mile away, could smell the individual scents of a dozen different wildflowers, could see the individual specks of light from stars millions of miles distant. But more than the physical changes, he felt the bond lock into place with a finality that was almost audible. Seraphine and Lilith weren't just presences in his mind anymore, they were part of him, woven into his very being. He could feel their hunger sated at last, their relief and joy and fierce possessiveness. And they could feel him. His wonder, his fear, his acceptance, his growing affection for these strange, ancient, impossible women who had chosen him. When they pulled back, they each bit their own wrists and held them to his mouth. "Drink," Seraphine commanded. "Take our power into yourself. Become what you were meant to be." He drank, and it was like swallowing liquid starlight and shadow. The power that had been flooding into him stabilized, integrated, became part of his fundamental nature. When he finally released their wrists, he felt transformed, remade into something more than human but not quite vampire, something in between, something unique. "The covenant is complete," Lilith whispered, tears of blood streaming down her face. "We are three but we are one. The bond is eternal." Seraphine pulled both of them into an embrace, her wings wrapping around them, creating a cocoon of warmth and closeness. For the first time in perhaps millennia, she wept, her cold facade completely shattered. "We are not alone," she said brokenly. "After so long we are not alone." They stood like that for a long time, three beings bound together by blood and choice and something that might have been love, or might have been something even deeper for which there was no name. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to a covenant that would reshape all their fates. A week later they began the journey back to Ashenmoor. They traveled at night, the sisters moving with predatory grace through the darkness while Cale followed, his newly enhanced strength and endurance allowing him to keep pace in ways that would have been impossible before. The bond was constantly present, a thread connecting the three of them, sometimes pulling taut with emotion, sometimes relaxing into comfortable companionship. They talked as they traveled, sharing stories, learning each other. Cale discovered that Seraphine had a dry, wicked sense of humor beneath her cold exterior, that she could be devastatingly funny when she chose to be. He learned that Lilith was not just impulsive but brilliant, with a scholar's mind that had been studying the nature of magic and reality for millennia. They were complex, layered, far more than the monsters of legend. And they, in turn, learned him. They drew out stories of his childhood, his parents, his dreams of exploring the world rather than just mapping it. They learned about his sense of inadequacy, the weight of expectations he'd never asked for, the quiet desperation of his life before the caves. "You were wasted in that village," Seraphine said bluntly one night as they camped in a shallow valley. "You have the mind of an explorer, a discoverer, but you were trapped in a life of repetition and survival. That ends now. Once the covenant is complete, once we've established ourselves, you'll have resources. You can explore whatever you want, document whatever catches your attention. We'll make sure of it." "Why?" Cale asked. "Why does my happiness matter to you? I understand the bond creates obligation, but—" "Because unhappy donors eventually become resentful donors," Lilith interrupted gently, "and resentment poisons the blood bond. But also because we like you, Cale. You're brave and honest and curious. You freed us when you could have walked away. You chose the covenant knowing full well what we are. That deserves to be rewarded with more than just survival. That deserves joy." As they neared Ashenmoor, Cale felt his anxiety spike. How would he explain the sisters? How would the village react to two obvious vampires walking among them? But Seraphine had already thought of that. "We'll stay hidden at first," she said. "Find us a place outside the village, somewhere secure where we can rest during the day. You go into the village, settle your affairs, gather whatever you need. Once you're free of obligations there, we'll leave together. No dramatic revelations, no confrontations. We slip away like ghosts, and your village never needs to know what you've become." There was an old mill on the outskirts of Ashenmoor, abandoned for years after the miller had died without heirs. Cale led them there, and the sisters immediately set about making it secure, their supernatural strength allowing them to move beams and boards that would have required a crew of men to shift. By dawn, they had created a light-proof shelter in the mill's basement, comfortable enough for their needs. "Go," Seraphine told Cale as the sun rose. "Do what you need to do. We'll be here when you return." 6 months later, Cale stood on the balcony of the manor house they'd acquired in a city 300 miles from Ashenmoor. It was a place of new beginnings, a cosmopolitan center where three people living in a non-traditional relationship raised few eyebrows, where Seraphine and Lilith could move with relative freedom as long as they avoided direct sunlight. The wealth they'd accumulated had been almost absurdly easy. Seraphine had remembered the locations of a dozen treasure caches from the old world, hidden stockpiles of gold and artifacts that had survived the centuries. With Cale as their day walker, they'd been able to recover those resources and convert them into modern currency and investments. But more than the wealth, they'd built something together. Cale had started his own cartography business, employing other young explorers and creating maps of exceptional detail and accuracy. His enhanced abilities made him capable of surveying in conditions that would defeat normal humans, and his reputation was growing steadily. The sisters had adapted to the modern world with remarkable speed. Seraphine had discovered a love for the new science, spending hours reading scientific texts and engaging with scholars who never suspected what she was. Lilith had found fulfillment in art, creating paintings that captured the strange beauty of the world as seen through vampire senses. And the bond between the three of them had only deepened. They were lovers, partners, family, something beyond any conventional relationship, something that worked precisely because they'd chosen it consciously and completely. "Are you happy?" Lilith asked, appearing beside him on the balcony with that supernatural silence they sometimes used. Cale thought about the question. He thought about his old life, the grinding poverty and loneliness. He thought about the moment in the cave when he'd made the choice that changed everything. And he smiled. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm happy. Are you?" "Happier than I've been in 3,000 years, she said, leaning against him. "We both are. You gave us back our lives, Cale. You gave us purpose and connection and hope. I don't think we can ever fully express what that means." Seraphine emerged from the manor's interior, carrying 3 glasses of wine, a habit she and Lilith had adopted even though they couldn't taste it, simply because Cale enjoyed the ritual. "The world is changing," she said, handing out the glasses. "War is coming to the southern provinces. New technologies are emerging that will transform everything. It's going to be a turbulent century. But we'll face it together," Cale said, raising his glass. "Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," the sisters echoed, and they drank, 3 beings bound by blood and choice, standing on the threshold of a future that was uncertain and dangerous and full of possibility. The covenant had been made. The bond was eternal. And whatever the coming years might bring, they would face it as they faced everything now, as one. In the years that followed, the 3 of them would become legends in their own right. They would face threats from both the human world and the surviving fragments of vampire society. They would travel to distant lands, uncover ancient secrets, and leave their mark on history in ways both subtle and profound. But that night, standing on the balcony with the city lights spreading out below them and the stars wheeling overhead, they were simply 3 souls who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to build something beautiful together. The vampire sisters had been trapped in a cave, prisoners of ancient betrayal and fading magic. But they had been freed by a man who chose them not out of desperation but out of genuine courage and curiosity. And in return, they had given him a life beyond anything he'd dared to imagine. It was not the ending of their story. It was barely the beginning. But it was exactly where they were meant to be, together, bound by blood and choice, facing an uncertain future with absolute certainty in each other. The covenant was complete. The bond was eternal.